Okay, so 4.2, this is the second video for Congress. In this one, I'm going to go over how a bill becomes a law. And in that, what a law is one piece of policy that Congress can make. Policy are actions made by the government. So congressional policy can be in the form of a law. We're also going to talk about the other things that Congress can do in the form of investigations and subpoenas, things like that. And then we're going to get into the real nitty gritty about incumbency, running for Congress, and things of that nature. So, first and foremost, my recommendation for a bill becomes a law is you should be able to provide a narrative, like a paragraph describing step by step how bills are passed, and you need to know this entire format. And so I'm going to go over it. But that is my recommendation: is that you would be able to narrate a paragraph of first the bill is introduced in the House, and then it is referred to committee, things of that nature, right? So let me go into this. First and foremost, bills, depending on the bill, but most bills can start in the House or they can start in the Senate. Does not matter which one they start in. But let's take a finance bill, right? Finance bill needs to be started in the House. Okay, so what's going to happen is basically a congressman in the House is going to refer a bill concept to a committee. Okay, so if we're doing, the budget bill, we need the budget committee. We need potentially the Ways and Means Committee, and so we're going to figure out where it's going to go. And so this committee, subcommittee component is trying to figure out exactly how we're going to work on the bill. So if you think of it as like an essay, this process here is figuring out how we're going to write the essay. So put the budget to the side, for example. Let's do instead a tax reform bill. Okay, we are going to increase taxes on the wealthy. Okay, so likely in the House, the congressman is going to figure out, okay, what bill or what committee is going to be best to bring this, raise taxes on the wealthy. So very likely they will bring it to the Ways and Means Committee. Ways and Means as in the ways in which we spend the money and the means of which we have to actually spend the money. So it would be the Ways and Means Committee. Likely under Ways and Means, because we're trying to raise taxes on the wealthy, we want to have the Taxation Subcommittee. And so the Taxation Subcommittee and the Ways and Means Committee is going to look at this bill. Congressmen in this committee are going to work on it. So we go from introducing the bill in the House, figuring out which committee, which subcommittee, and they're going to basically take the bill and mark it up, put on notes, change things, compromise things. And through this process, this is where you would likely have interest groups input as well and add things to the bill. And so this is the creation process. So now it's like we got our rough draft of our bill in the House. So now we go to the House Rules Committee. So this is our traffic cop, green light or red light. And the people on the House Rules Committee are basically going to hear the congressman who created the bill in committee present their pitch. Here is the bill we are creating, and the House Rules Committee is going to say, great, let's take it to the full floor. Let's have everyone get an opportunity to discuss it. Or they're going to say, you need to do more work on this. You need to go back. Go back to committee, fix it, come back, try again, but ultimately the gatekeeper. Okay, so we've gotten past the gatekeeper. Rules Committee says, great job, guys. This is looking good to raise taxes on the wealthy, and so we bring it to the full floor. Excellent. So assuming it passes, okay, so it would need to pass in the House, okay, so it would be a 51% pass, okay, and then it goes to this conference committee. So pause on conference committee, because after it's passed in the House, so we've gone through introduce it, work on it in committee, rough draft, Rules Committee says, great, good job. Now we're going to talk about it on the floor, now we're going to vote, passes in the House. So now we go to the Senate, and we have to do the same thing in the Senate. There's a Ways and Means Committee in the Senate. There's a Taxation Subcommittee. We're going to chew on it, and it's going to be very similar. It's not going to be the same thing. We're not going to take this bill and just transport it to the Senate. No, a senator is going to introduce something very similar. They're going to create their rough draft, and then who decides whether it goes to the floor? That would be the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell. And so let's say it goes through all this, rough draft. Mitch McConnell says, good job. Let's bring it to the full floor. We're going to talk it out. Passes, the way it has to pass in the Senate is you have to pass 60 votes. So it's 60 votes to end debate in the Senate, and that 60 votes we call a cloture. So everyone's discussing it. And then we get 60 senators to say, okay, we're done with debate. Now what we're going to do is we're going to vote. If you don't get the 60, you cannot vote. Assuming we get the 60, okay, end of the debate. Now we can vote on it. Now, after we got the 60 to end debate, now we only need 51% to pass. Kind of weird. So to say it a different way, when you're voting in the Senate, you need 60 votes to actually vote on the bill. And then to pass the bill, you only need 51. Okay. So this raising taxes on the wealthy, it passed through the House, passed through the Senate. So now what we have to do is create this conference committee. A conference committee is made only for the sake of bringing the two bills together. They're trying to reconcile any differences. There may be amendments added to compensate for differences in the House and the Senate version that passed through. So what's going to happen is they're going to create this committee. So this will be House and senators meeting together, discussing the bill that was passed, and merging, trying to bring it together. So in the conference committee, they meet together, and then the House look at what they come up with. So in the green, you're basically going from one bill, a second bill, and you're going to merge those into one fancy new bill. Okay, now that we have the fancy new bill, the House is going to consider it. They say, okay, good, that looks nice. The Senate parties, they're going to look at the new fancy bill. They're going to say, oh, yeah, that looks good. Then they're going to send it to the Resolute desk. Okay, they're going to send it to the president's desk for signature. And the president has two options. They can sign it. Excellent. Bill becomes a law. We did it. But also the president can do what's called a veto. And this is a constitutional power. A veto means that you do not agree. So Congress passes a bill, and as a check on the power of Congress, the chief executive has the power to veto it. They have to inform the public and Congress, more importantly, why they are vetoing the bill, although it is within the president's power to do so. So that doesn't mean it's done. If the president vetoes it, the House and Senate can look at it, and while the House and Senate passed the first one by 51%, if the president vetoes it and they pass it by 2/3, it becomes a law. And so, there is this beautiful system of checks and balances in here. And my recommendation is for you to kind of pick like a bill idea and try and follow it all the way through. Right. So when we go to actually like the making of the policy itself, right, I talked a little bit about like the process of a bill becomes a law. And it's really important to also understand the role of this House Rules Committee, because there are so many people in the House. We need to have a traffic cop to make sure we're not wasting people's time. And so this is an example. This is showing a demonstration of the House Rules Committee. So these congressmen are listening to Representative Tom Price discuss his healthcare law repeal. And they're going to say, okay, Representative Price, this sounds good. Go to the full floor. Or they're going to say, sorry, Representative Price, you need to go back to the Budget Committee and discuss this further. Okay. In the House and the Senate, in the House specifically, because this is the House Rules Committee, the Speaker appoints the members of committee. It is a big deal to be on the House Rules Committee, and the Speaker right now, Nancy Pelosi, she would only choose someone as the chair or as a member of the House Rules Committee if she knows that they're going to help send more Democratic legislation to the floor. And so definitely a strategic kind of move here, but not just the Rules Committee. The Speaker does appoint all committee assignments in the House, and then the Senate Majority Leader appoints all the committee assignments in the Senate. But back to the point, it matters that the Speaker appoints the committee members because they get to choose and they could influence how the House Rules Committee may help their specific party. Now, the Congress doesn't just make laws, right? They don't just pass federal laws. The other thing that Congress does is practices oversight. Oversight is an investigation into another branch, okay? So if a congressman is doing something illegal, that's not oversight. Like if Congress investigates like a congressman, with like drug use or something like that, the House Ethics Committee will deal with that. Oversight is when Congress investigates the president or Congress investigates the judiciary. It is Congress investigating the, FBI, independent agency. So it's the idea of monitoring the other branches. And again, this is another check on the power of the other branches. And so when you talk about oversight, Congress has the constitutional power to call hearings. Okay, so you could be what's called subpoenaed to Congress. So a subpoena is a call to court. So if you are subpoenaed to court, it's basically the government saying you have to show up to court. In Congress, it's a similar thing. So they will subpoena people to come before a certain committee, specifically the House Oversight Committee or the Senate Oversight Committee. This is Jerry Nadler, who's the chair of the House Oversight Committee. So they're going to call hearings. They're going to issue a subpoena, meaning they're going to give like a piece of paper that says you're required to come to Congress and testify in front of Congress. And testifying to Congress is very similar to testifying under, in a court of law. So if you do lie to Congress, you will, perjure yourself, and that is a felony. And so when we talk about this as oversight, it's usually used to investigate the president or the executive branch specifically. And so when you think back to, like Nixon and the actions of that, oversight was used constantly. When you talk about Trump being president and the Democrats wanting to investigate Trump, you would say that they are utilizing their oversight power. This is in the Constitution, and so you would say Congress not only passes bills, but they also practice oversight. Okay. This I'm not going to show right now, but highly recommend. It's pretty short. I don't know, and I think it just shows a good idea of like a single day in the life of a representative. Very busy, and I think, does a good job. Okay. All right. So let's talk about elections. So running for Congress, because we talked a lot about running for president, let's talk about Congress. So first thing, this is Ken Calvert's. Unfortunately, Ken Calvert is no longer, representative where I grew up in Orange County, but we're going to use Ken Calvert as an example and his little dog Tulip, which definitely humanizes the politician. So we'll get into that too. But when you talk about running for Congress, who wins? The incumbent. The incumbent is the person who is already holding office. So growing up in Orange County, from the time I was born to the time that I was in high school and college, Ken Calvert was the representative of the district I grew up in California. And so Ken Calvert demonstrates the norm, especially in the House, is that if you are in office, you are much more likely to win again, and you are much more likely to stay in office as well. And so what we look at is 90%, this is in the House. You would say that congressmen in the House have a better chance as an incumbent to be reelected than in the Senate. Senators are still likely as incumbents to be reelected, but not as likely, not as consistent as the House. And then, the other thing too is not just winning the election, but a lot of them who are incumbents will win with over 60% of the vote. You only need 51%. Sometimes we can have a runoff in Congress. I'll get into that in a moment too. But to say this a different way, congressmen who have been there before usually win again. And when they win, it's usually by a pretty comfortable margin too, especially in the House. Okay, we'll come back to Tulip. All right. So you can see, just an example, going into the 08 election here, you can see how the incumbency, especially here, you can see the change. Ultimately, why is there such a big change in 1980? You could look at the differences of having going from Carter to Reagan and kind of potentially a critical election type of thing. Not quite, but pretty close. But you can see in general, how much more incumbents are held in the House, but still high degree in the Senate. Okay. So you're talking about why do incumbents win? What sets them apart? What gives them an advantage? Well, one thing is the advertising. And so if you're in there longer, you have name value. So why do I know Ken Calvert? Well, he was a congressman forever, right? He came to classrooms. He came to my classroom. This is not my classroom that I was in. But the idea is that, you have this name value because, your name is out there. You're advertising, especially within your district. And then there's also what we call casework. Casework is congressmen doing good things for their district, right? Or doing good things for their state. So for example, if Ken Calvert fights to keep jobs in Southern Orange County, that's something that I can look at as a voter and say, wow, Ken Calvert brought jobs to our district. He improved the economy of my local district. I really like that. I'm going to vote for him, compared to a challenger where it's like, well, you weren't in Congress. I don't know what you might do as a congressman. So that's casework. It's kind of like, what do you do for your constituents? And it is bragging. It's very much bragging, like, oh, look what I did for my constituents. And then the other thing, this is definitely a negative connotation, pork barrel. The technical term that we use in government is called an earmark. And an earmark means if we have $1 billion that we have to spend, like we could say $1 million goes to education, but we might earmark like 500,000 specifically for like an infrastructure project in South Orange County. And so pork barrel is oftentimes where you are adding things into a bill that may not fit, but you're adding it in there as a way to brag to your constituents. Look what I've done for us. Look how well I have done as your representative. This is why you should vote for me again. So I'll go over a little bit pork barrel in more in depth, but pork barrel is basically, let's add pieces to a bill. They don't necessarily relate to the actual bill itself, but it's a way for congressmen to kind of sneak in like little pieces of, oh, look what I've done for us, right? Rand Paul loves pork barrel as far as like adding on amendments to bills and things like that. And then the last thing that we can see is that as far as like incumbents go, you can look it up online. You can see Ken Calvert's voting record on every bill that has passed or that has gone through the House. And so as a constituent, you can really look at, okay, what are they claiming to done for our district? Can I actually go see their voting record? Does their voting record match what they've been advertising on television? And so to say this a different way, we just have more data on the incumbent. We just have more exposure, more name value, and this is not even including the franking component. So a lot of advantages to the incumbent. One more note on pork barrel is it's usually, like I said, a negative connotation. We often look at it as wasteful. Pork meaning just like fat, like wasteful, not like high quality meat, I guess you could say. So for example, so this is one of my favorite. This Bridge to Nowhere. So it says, because credit claiming is so important to re-election, Congress rarely passes up on an opportunity to help their state or district. So my favorite is this Bridge to Nowhere, $223 million to replace the ferry because the airport I think it was this island, because the airport is on the island, and they were starting to build a bridge so you wouldn't have to have the ferry, and they started building it, and then they just canceled it. And so we basically have a bridge that jets out and is not finished. But the idea was that in Alaska, in Ketchikan, it's terrible. But like the idea is that the congressman in Alaska was able to secure federal funding to help them start build a bridge. They only canceled it because, of the criticism. But basically, you would take a bill like a healthcare bill, and then you would add in $223 million for a Bridge to Nowhere. A lot of people look at this as the negative components of Washington. Pork barrel is considered bad, and this is also perception. If it's your congressman, oh, the pork barrel, that's a good thing because it helps us. But if you see it in another district, you're like, oh, how wasteful. Right? Okay. Other advantages of incumbency. The other thing is that you usually have pretty weak challengers. And you take Leahy here. So Leahy running Blue Dog Democrat. Blue Dog Democrat meaning pretty moderates, had been in New York for a very long time. And the fact that you have someone like AOC come in, it's not the norm. Leahy should have won. And the fact that AOC did win, and now she is winning, she has this incumbency advantage. But oftentimes, AOCs will not win, so to speak. And a lot of it comes from the lack of campaign spending. The incumbent, they're going to be able to spend more because they'll have the party support. They'll have more of the donor support. They'll have the PAC support. The interest groups are going to very likely support the incumbent more than the challenger. And so I guess to say this a different way, if you're running for Congress, what is your best opportunity to win? It's if you're an incumbent, but if not, the best way to win is when there's an open seat. So in this example, you have an incumbent running against a challenger. the best way to win is this guy steps down, and then it's this person versus the other person. So it's a non-incumbent versus a non-incumbent. That's your best chance to win. But if you're going against an incumbent, AOC is very much the exception to the rule. All right, so moving right along, when you talk about congressional elections, it's also important to look at the actual voters themselves. And the voters most oftentimes are going to vote based on the party and really nothing else. So this person, I don't know who they are, but they are a Republican, I'm going to vote for them. Or this person, I don't know who they are, but they are a Democrat, so I'm going to vote for them. And this is just very common. Party voting here. And so when you talk about this idea of descriptive representation, is do the congressmen, do they actually represent the interests of the constituents? Because when you look at the congressman making a decision, are they making it based on their own opinion? Are they making it based on their constituents? Are they making it based on the party in Congress? Are there other pressures coming in, like a re-election? And so when you talk about voting for someone, it may not actually represent what your values are, but just understand that most times when people vote, especially for Congress, it's based on the party. So let's take Georgia, for example, as a runoff election. You may not know who the people running are, but you see that they're a Democrat, you see that they're a Republican, that's who they're going to vote for, right? So especially for Congress, it's a very reliable metric. And this is just a statistic we have from the 2008 election. 90% of voters who identify with a party vote for the House candidate of their party. And so think about this from the perspective of, right before the election, so many people complaining about different congressmen, different senators. People complain about Lindsey Graham. They complain about Mitch McConnell, and yet they won very handedly. And then you look at the House. People complain about the different Democratic, caucus. Maybe Nancy, for example, wasn't even close as far as the election. And why? Because most people voting for Congress, they usually just vote based on the party, regardless of their policies. Okay. So how do you defeat an incumbent, right? You're not going to have the PAC money. You're not necessarily going to have the party support. It's going to be difficult. But understand that oftentimes, if an incumbent faces a scandal, this is a likely opportunity for someone to step in. So scandal is a big part of it. And then the other thing that could happen is a redistricting. So the state legislatures, and we'll talk about this later too, the state legislatures are the ones that actually redraw the lines. But what we're looking at is with the incumbency advantage, if they redraw the lines to take, if you're a Republican and they take Republican voters out of your district, your likelihood of winning is not as likely. And so, scandal, redistricting. And then the other thing that may happen is you get these waves, like a blue wave or a red wave. And so oftentimes these waves of people voting more Democrat or more Republican can also happen. And we see the wave more of like a overall kind of thing, not just in like maybe a specific state. And again, if you're going to defeat an incumbent, they're going to have to succumb to some sort of scandal, or you're going to have to redistrict the lines to make it an impact. Or honestly, other than the incumbent, the best way to beat someone is if there's no one else, an incumbent running. But okay, so this is this point. What is your best chance to win in Congress if you are not running against an opponent? If you are running against someone, but they have not been in office, this is your best opportunity. So we call this an open seat, okay? When there's an incumbent, it's an incumbent versus a challenger. If the incumbent decides I'm not going to run, they're going to retire or something like that, then it becomes open. So what happens is oftentimes when an open seat comes in, this is the most competitive. And so sometimes open seats will have a runoff election because winner take all. Winner take all means that to win the seat, so this is the U.S. Senate, so in Louisiana, okay? So you have John Kennedy here. All these people ran, but you see the number of Republicans that split the Republican vote and then the number of Democrats splitting the Democratic vote. No one even got close to 51%. So the idea is that why do you see this? Well, because it's an open seat. You have the best opportunity to win. And so if this were an incumbent challenger race, you would not see this many people running. And so the idea of this winner take all, it's very easy if there's really only the incumbent and the challenger. But because it's open, you have all these people run. It becomes 25% and 17.5 between John Kennedy and Foster Campbell. And so John Kennedy and Foster Campbell have a runoff. Foster Campbell loses. John Kennedy wins in the runoff election, even though in the first election he only got 25% of the voters in Louisiana. Right. So a couple of final points. Some good things that you can consider if there's a high re-election rate in the Senate and the House is that there's this stability, that despite the president perhaps changing every 4 years, Congress remains consistent, keeping the status quo. And then, there's also this idea of, a change in Congress, occurs less frequently through elections. Oftentimes the change in Congress is from a change of policy and not necessarily from a change in the actual people there. People's opinions change, the party changes based on the electorate. But oftentimes the change occurs when someone is already in there, and then they kind of change their opinion rather than putting a new person in there. Cool. And then the other thing you would talk about is it is a good thing to be in there more than a single term. So for example, learning the job of a House of Representatives member it's 2 years as a term, but after the first year, you really have to be starting to think about re-election. That's not a lot of time to learn how to do that job. And so maybe you want someone in the House who's there for 3, 4, 5 terms to kind of learn to do the job. Same thing with a senator. 6 years may seem like a long time, but as like a freshman senator, there's a learning curve. And so the idea of having people in Congress longer is despite a 2-year term or a 6-year term, it may take longer than that to actually learn how to do the job. Oops. And then the other thing that we have is term limits in Congress have been ruled unconstitutional. We have the presidential term limit, you get 2. But as far as serving in Congress, there are no term limits. So some pros and cons on that, right? Pros, new blood, you get new ideas in Congress. You have less career politicians, so maybe different, greater diversity of ideas. You can actually have instead of people just in Congress, they actually have to live as citizens, later if they're limited to the amount of time they have to be there. That may change how things pass. And then, incumbency is not as much of a factor, right? That would be a good thing to have, congressional term limits. But the cons, though, is if you have term limits, you're going to limit the experience because you can only be there for a certain amount of time. If there's no term limits, you're really open to control of lobbyists paying for elections and things like that. And the Constitution doesn't set limits. So if we're going to say that congressional term limits need to happen, why are they not written in the Constitution? And so this comes to the constitutionality of term limits. And while I do say they are unconstitutional, I suppose that is, a judicial decision. In the past, their constitutionality has not necessarily been approved, but, that could change. And the other thing, too, is, if you want to vote for someone to run in Congress and you want them to be their congressman, they should be able to win their election, and you shouldn't be, hindered by a term limit. Okay, great, guys. So this one really went into a lot with how a bill becomes a law, the different policies of Congress, and what we'll also talk about getting into this, too, is just, what can Congress do? And, the last thing that we'll really get into is a little bit about the filibuster. And then we'll kind of go over just like in general things you may need to know for Congress. But there's a lot of like nitty gritty. And we'll talk more about how you can shape this into an argument essay pretty soon.